The moment I realized I had been tricked into dating a paralyzed woman, I stood frozen in the entrance of a sunlit restaurant while every person at the nearest table turned to watch my reaction. Sitting beside the window was a woman in a wheelchair, her hands folded tightly over a pale blue dress, her expression caught somewhere between humiliation and courage. Behind me, my friends were laughing as though they had arranged a harmless joke. But when the woman looked directly into my eyes and quietly said that she had not known I was being deceived, the laughter died so suddenly that I could hear the trembling breath she tried to hide. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, because what happened after that painful introduction changed far more than two lives. My name is Everett Cole, and at 34, I had built a life that looked successful from the outside but felt strangely empty when no one was watching. I worked as a commercial property consultant in Portland, Maine, wore tailored jackets, drove a polished black sedan, and spent most afternoons moving between meetings in glass office buildings. My parents had raised me to be dependable, but after my fiancée left me 2 years earlier for a man she described as more emotionally available, I had learned to protect myself with sarcasm and distance. My friends mistook that distance for confidence. The loudest among them was Fletcher Knox, a former college roommate who treated every human weakness as material for entertainment. When he told me he had arranged a blind lunch date with a charming woman named Maren Whitlock, he described her as intelligent, artistic, and unforgettable. He never mentioned the wheelchair. He never mentioned that she had survived an accident. More importantly, he never told Maren that the date was part of a cruel challenge designed to see whether I would stay or walk away. Maren's cheeks were burning as I approached the table. Afternoon sunlight spilled across her chestnut hair, revealing silver threads near her temples that made her look dignified rather than older. Her wheelchair was sleek but worn around one wheel, and a canvas bag hung from the back with several paintbrushes visible inside. I wanted to leave. Not because she was paralyzed, though I wish I could say my first reaction was completely noble. I wanted to leave because I felt ambushed, exposed, and furious. Yet as Fletcher and the others slipped outside, still grinning through the restaurant window, Maren lowered her eyes and apologized for something that was not her fault. That apology stopped me. I sat down, not from generosity, but because I refused to let the cruelest people in the room decide what kind of man I would be. The first 15 minutes were painfully stiff. I asked questions that sounded rehearsed. Maren answered politely while staring at the untouched tea in front of her. She explained that she was a watercolor illustrator who designed book covers and taught an art class at a rehabilitation center twice a week. 5 years earlier, she had been driving home from an exhibition when a distracted truck driver crossed the center line. The collision damaged her spinal cord, leaving her without movement below the waist. She said this plainly, without asking for sympathy. Then she asked about my work, and when I described commercial property negotiations, she smiled and said it sounded like an occupation invented by someone who wanted arguments to have business cards. I laughed before I could stop myself. It was the first honest laugh I had experienced in months. What should have been an awkward lunch became a 3-hour conversation. Maren spoke about color the way other people spoke about music. She believed every person carried an emotional shade they could not see in themselves. She said mine was winter gray with a thin line of gold hidden underneath. I told her that sounded suspiciously optimistic. She replied that optimism and denial were not the same thing, and that people who had suffered usually understood the difference. By the time we left, I had forgotten the watching strangers and nearly forgotten Fletcher's prank. Then I noticed Maren struggling with the restaurant's steep entrance ramp. One wheel caught against a cracked edge, and the chair tilted sharply. I grabbed the handle before she fell. She thanked me, but the humiliation in her face was unmistakable. The building where I regularly brought clients had failed someone in the simplest, most avoidable way, and until that moment, I had never noticed. Outside, Fletcher was leaning against his car, waiting for a reaction. He asked whether I deserved an award for surviving lunch. Maren heard him. I saw the moment the full cruelty of the setup became clear to her. Her shoulders stiffened, and the warmth disappeared from her expression. She wheeled herself toward the curb, refusing my help. I turned on Fletcher with an anger so sharp it frightened even me. I told him he had not embarrassed Maren, he had revealed himself. Then I followed her, but she was already transferring into a specially equipped car driven by an older woman. Before the door closed, Maren looked at me and said she hoped I understood that pity was not a foundation for anything meaningful. I stood on the sidewalk as the car drove away, knowing I had not earned the right to explain myself. For the next several days, I could not stop thinking about her. I remembered the way she had described painting rain without showing a single drop. I remembered her humor, her steadiness, and the quiet injury in her face when she realized she had been used. I sent one message apologizing for my friends and for my failure to recognize the prank sooner. She did not respond. I sent no second message because I did not want my guilt to become another burden she had to manage. Instead, I visited the restaurant owner and asked why the entrance ramp had never been repaired. He gave excuses about permits and cost. By the end of the week, I had contacted a contractor, reviewed municipal accessibility guidelines, and offered to cover part of the expense if the owner completed the work properly. I told myself I was correcting a professional blind spot. Deep down, I knew I was trying to become the kind of man who would have noticed before someone nearly fell. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at my office. Inside was a small watercolor painting of the restaurant window. A gray silhouette stood outside beneath a pale sky, and through the glass, a narrow line of gold crossed an empty table. On the back, Maren had written that she had heard about the repaired ramp. She thanked me for changing something without asking to be praised for it. Beneath that, she added that if I still wanted an honest conversation, she would be teaching at the Harbor Renewal Center on Saturday afternoon. The rehabilitation center was brighter than I expected, filled with wide windows, indoor plants, and the scent of paper and paint. Maren sat at the center of a semicircle of students, some using wheelchairs, some recovering from strokes, and others living with injuries that had changed the movement of their hands. She did not inspire them with speeches. She treated them like artists. When one man grew frustrated because his brush shook, Maren showed him how the trembling lines could become branches in wind. When a teenage girl refused to paint because she could not hold the brush tightly, Maren attached it to a soft wrist brace and asked her to choose the first color. Watching her, I understood that strength was not the absence of grief. It was the decision to create something while grief remained. After class, Maren agreed to have coffee with me in the center courtyard. She told me the prank had reopened wounds she had worked hard to close. Since the accident, strangers had spoken to her slowly as though paralysis had affected her intelligence. Dates had treated her either as an inspirational project or a secret they were afraid to introduce to friends. One man had spent an entire meal praising himself for being open-minded. She said she would rather be rejected honestly than accepted for applause. I admitted that I had once avoided people who made me uncomfortable because discomfort forced me to see how narrow my life had become. I told her I was drawn to her, but I did not yet trust my own motives. Instead of being offended, she said that uncertainty was more honest than a dramatic promise that we began seeing each other slowly. Our afternoons were ordinary in ways that felt extraordinary to me. We visited galleries, ate sandwiches near the waterfront, and argued over whether abstract art was profound or merely expensive confusion. I learned how to place her wheelchair in my car without making a performance of helping. She learned that I hated hospitals because my mother had died in one when I was 19. We both carried old abandonment differently. Maren feared being loved temporarily, while I feared being known deeply enough to be left. Those fears collided more than once. The worst conflict came when I invited Maren to a company charity luncheon but failed to tell her that Fletcher would be there. I had ended the friendship after the prank, yet our firm still shared clients. When Maren saw him across the ballroom, she became visibly tense. Fletcher approached with a forced apology and spoke about personal growth as though he were presenting quarterly results. Then he said the prank had at least brought us together. Maren's expression hardened. She told him that a good outcome did not make cruelty necessary. I agreed with her, but too late and too quietly. On the drive home, she accused me of protecting professional comfort instead of protecting her dignity. I became defensive and reminded her that I had cut Fletcher out of my personal life. She said partial courage was still partial. We stopped speaking for 11 days. During that silence, I returned to the version of myself I had been before meeting her. I buried myself in work, answered every emotional thought with another appointment, and convinced myself that relationships were impossible when both people carried too much damage. Then I received a call from Maren's aunt, Celeste Whitlock, the woman who had driven her from the restaurant. Maren had developed a severe pressure wound, a dangerous complication for people with limited sensation. She had been admitted to the hospital for treatment and surgery. Celeste was not calling because Maren had asked for me. She was calling because Maren had listed me as her emergency contact months earlier and had never changed it. The hospital room was filled with late morning light when I arrived. Maren was awake but pale, her hair loosely tied, her confidence stripped down to exhaustion. She asked why I had come. I said that being angry did not erase caring. She told me not to stay from obligation. I sat in the chair beside her and admitted that obligation was easier than love because it came with rules. Love required presence without guarantees, and I had spent years avoiding anything I could not control. I apologized for expecting her to accept half measures simply because they were better than what she had received before. I told her she had not made my life difficult, she had made dishonesty difficult. Maren's recovery lasted several weeks, all during long summer days that seemed to stretch across the hospital walls. I did not become a heroic caretaker. Celeste handled most medical decisions, nurses managed the treatment, and Maren fiercely protected her independence. I simply showed up. I brought her sketchbook. I read contracts aloud when she wanted distraction and terrible local news stories when she wanted to laugh. Some afternoons she was warm. Other afternoons she asked me to leave after 10 minutes. I learned that love was not measured only by gratitude. Sometimes it meant accepting that another person's pain did not exist to make you feel needed. While Maren recovered, I began reviewing accessibility across the commercial properties my firm represented. What started with one restaurant became a broader initiative. I found blocked ramps, narrow restroom entrances, broken elevators, inaccessible emergency exits, and reception desks built too high for wheelchair users. At first, my partners resisted the cost. Then I presented the legal risks, the lost customers, and the human consequences. I invited disability advocates to inspect several buildings and paid them as consultants. Maren refused to be the face of the project, saying she did not want our relationship used as marketing. I respected that. The initiative moved forward without her photograph, without dramatic press releases, and without pretending I had invented accessibility. Months later, Fletcher appeared at my office. His company had lost a major contract after a recording surfaced of him making cruel jokes about a disabled employee. For once, he was not smiling. He asked me to speak on his behalf. I told him forgiveness did not require rescuing someone from consequences. Still, I gave him the contact information for a workplace accountability program and suggested he begin by apologizing to the employee without asking for anything in return. He accused me of becoming self-righteous. I nearly reacted with anger, but then I recognized the same defensive fear I had once carried. I told him that change felt like humiliation when a person had built his identity around never being wrong. Whether he changed after that was his responsibility. Maren returned to teaching in early autumn, though every part of her life still happened beneath clear daylight and open skies. On her first afternoon back, her students surprised her with a mural made of individual painted squares. Each square showed an object that represented resilience: a cracked cup holding flowers, a bent tree still covered in leaves, a bridge repaired with visible seams. In the center was a gray sky crossed by a single line of gold. Maren looked at me across the room, and I understood that the color she had once seen hidden in me was no longer hidden. A year after our first disastrous meeting, the restaurant hosted a community art auction to raise money for adaptive art equipment. The repaired entrance was wide, smooth, and lined with planters. Maren arrived wearing a deep green dress, moving through the doorway without assistance. Her largest painting hung near the window. It showed two figures at a table, separated by shadows but connected by sunlight across the floor. The title was The Choice to Stay. Before the auction began, I asked Maren to come with me into the courtyard. I did not kneel, because she had once joked that proposals should not turn one person into a monument and the other into a spectator. Instead, I sat on the low stone walls so our eyes were level. I told her I could not promise a life without fear, conflict, illness, or mistakes. I could only promise that I would not hide when those things arrived. Then I asked her to marry me. She cried before she answered. Not delicate tears, but deep, shaking sobs that came from years of being treated as temporary, difficult, or brave for simply existing. She said yes, then made me repeat the question because she wanted to hear it once without crying. When we returned inside, Celeste saw the ring first and covered her mouth with both hands. The students cheered. Even the restaurant owner wiped his eyes behind the counter. What shocked everyone was not that a man had chosen to marry a paralyzed woman. The real shock was how completely Maren had changed the people around her without ever asking to be anyone's lesson. She taught me that dignity is not something we give to others, it is something we either recognize or refuse to see. She taught Celeste to loosen the protective grip she had carried since the accident. She taught her students that altered bodies could still create beautiful lives. And she taught an entire business community that accessibility was not charity. It was belonging. Our wedding took place on a bright spring afternoon in a botanical garden with smooth stone pathways and white blossoms opening above us. Maren rolled toward me without being escorted, because she wanted no symbol suggesting she was being given away. Her hands trembled as she reached for mine. Mine trembled too. During the vows, I told her that the worst trick ever played on us had led me to the first honest relationship of my life. She replied that love had not saved her from disability, because she had never needed to be saved from herself. Love had simply given both of us a place where neither person had to pretend. Just before the ceremony ended, Maren looked toward our families and friends and reminded everyone that cruelty often begins when people turn someone else's life into entertainment, while healing begins when one person chooses to see the human being standing, sitting, struggling, or hoping in front of them. So please leave a meaningful comment sharing what this story taught you about dignity, forgiveness, or the courage to look beyond first impressions. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the moment designed to humiliate us becomes the moment that reveals who we truly are, and sometimes the person others expect us to pity becomes the person who teaches us how to love with courage, honesty, and grace.